Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll discuss a game where both sides have castled on opposite sides of the board and see what are important elements in such a game. Let's start out with this position that was reached after White's 15th move. Well, we can see that both sides have already castled, White to the queen side while Black to the king side. We can also see that Black has a pair of bishops while White has a bishop and knight in addition to the pair of knights on the board. As of pawns concerned, there is material balance at the moment. At the first view, I think we can immediately tell that Black is in pretty good shape because their dark squared bishop is aiming on that long diagonal towards where the white king is. Also, another good thing for Black, that Black no longer has his c-pawn, and therefore after the other black bishop develops from c8, the black rook will be able to come to the open c5, at least it's open from Black's perspective because Black has no pawn there, so therefore Black has several things going for him as of the attack concerned against the white king. If you look at it from the other side, the black king's position looks a lot safer, with all three pawns still in front of the king and the bishop also guarding the king, while White doesn't really have a dangerous attacking target in that it's true that the F file is kind of open, but that's not the file where the king is, and Black has an excellent defense with a rook on f8 on the f7 pawn anyway. Moreover, after the black bishop develops from c8 to e6, it will also guard that pawn naturally. So overall, my first view would be, if I look at this position, that I'd certainly prefer playing with Black. Well, that's kind of a generic evaluation of the situation, but after that we actually need to think of specifics. What to do next? Well, the first thing we need to be aware as of comes to specifics, that is that the pawn is hanging at the moment on d6. So question is what to do. Black does not have a simple, natural or easy way to protect that pawn at all, so Black needs to look for ways to sacrifice it in the most efficient way. Well, what Black needs to do, Black needs to follow up the development. However, if Black plays bishop e6 right away, White actually would not capture on d6, but would play knight d4 and then try to trade the knight for the bishop. So therefore, Black played first exchanging knights, and when pawn captured back, only here playing bishop e6. Black doesn't mind losing that pawn as long as he'll gain time in the meantime in developing the attack against White's king. For example, if now White indeed would capture that pawn, Black's plan is to play queen a5. This is very typical for such and similar positions that are typically rising from the dragon variation of the Sicilian. Black has the two bishops aiming both towards White's king, the queen is there, and the rooks are coming to c8, sometimes doubling up on the c-file, or c8 and d8. We can clearly see the trouble that White is facing because the rook will come to c8, and the black bishop at any time can trade on c3, and then of course the pawn on a2 will be lost as well. So Black usually doesn't even necessarily rush giving up that bishop for the knight, but oftentimes rather plays rook c8 first and gives the rook up for the knight to continue with the attack. The bishop, in this case, may sometimes even show up his head on h6. So you can try to play out this position with a friend or a silicon friend, and you'll see that black is doing just fine, having plenty of compensation for the pawn. But let's go back and see what happens when white does not capture the pawn on d6, which white didn't in this game, but plays king b1, which by the way is a very typical and recommended idea to get the king out of the c file on one hand, just like the black king, remember, was out of the f file, which was earlier open from white's perspective, and also it protects the a2 pawn. Now black has several playable ideas. The same queen a5 idea is not as good as it was in case white captured the d6 pawn, because now white would play knight d5, and that immediately would create a discovery, of course, to the black queen, and the exchange of queens would certainly be a big relief for white, because as we know, no attack is as dangerous without queens as it is with queens on the board. On the other hand, if the queen doesn't want to trade, then the queen, for example, moves to a4, white could follow up and still try to insist on the trading idea, and either black will trade or will need to retreat. So white would be doing okay here. So queen a5 in this particular position is not the ideal choice. There are several others though that are quite worthy of trying. One would be to play queen f6 in this position, which immediately would put pressure on white's pawn on f3. And then after bishop e2, black could play rook c. We can see now how the black bishop and queen has a beautiful battery built up on the long diagonal, and in a way tying down the white knight, which needs to be very careful not to move and allow the checkmate on b2. So this was one idea. Another idea that's worth consideration is to play queen b6 in this position. And then if queen takes the pawn, come in to f2 and try to cause trouble to white from this direction. And there was a third idea also, and this is one of those situations where it's a lot of a matter of taste, matter of choice, whichever way you want to continue. The way black continued was rook c8, which is certainly a natural move as well. Again, white would have the opportunity to capture the pawn on d6, but the black queen would move to a5, and we would reach something very similar as we already discussed with the previous comment, when white could have captured the pawn on d6 a move earlier. And again, similar issues we discussed. Black is about to capture the knight on c3 and then on a2. So white again did not capture on d6, but played knight to d5, trying to neutralize the bishop's power on e6. And here black has several choices. One is to play rook c5, which I personally like quite a lot, with the idea to then get the queen out and double rooks. But the game itself continued with bishop capturing on d5. It's a common belief that when you have opposite colored bishops left on the board, the game is likely to end in the draw, which is certainly true for endgames, a lot of endgames. However, actually in middle game, when attack is still in the picture, like it is in this case, it typically actually helps the side that's attacking. Why? because when there is a weak point, like in this case on b2, it's easier to take advantage of it with no opposite bishop to protect that very square. And now it's time to get finally the queen to the attack, and black chose to come to f6. If the queen would go to b6 right away, white would have a good response by queen b3. So going back, the queen went to f6. Certainly a better choice. And now the queen doesn't only attack the pawn, which by the way is a checkmate threat, but also attacks the other pawn on f3. Now white has two choices: either to continue as they did in the game by playing c3, or protect both pawns with the queen. If white chooses to do the latter, then black will immediately bring the rook out, a very powerful move with the threat of then playing rook b6. Although white can hang on for the moment by playing rook d5, so to answer rook b6 with then rook b5, black still will have a rather strong initiative after rook c8, threatening on c2, c4, rook b6, rook b5, take, take, and then queen d4. White has certainly issues to resolve. Let's go back to the actual game where white continued by playing c3 in this position. On one hand, it seems that it resolves the issues on that long diagonal, but quite often it doesn't do the job, because actually black will be able to sacrifice on c3. Well, the moment is not quite ripe yet for it, but black simply first captured the pawn, which creates an immediate double attack on the two white rooks. But white can still save this problem by playing bishop d3. So right now black is up a pawn, which is certainly good news, while the attack is still going. In the meantime, black took it slowly by protecting the pawn on d6. Black has two good ways to do that. One would be to do it with the bishop, or to do it as he did in the game with the rook. Putting the rook on c6 keeps in mind the opportunities to come with the rook to b6. And now white made a mistake which speed up the end of the game. White played bishop to c2, I assume with ideas of playing rook f1 and then bishop b3 trying to target on f7. But white never got to do any of those, because it is action time. And it's time to destroy the defense in front of the white king. Well, with this move, white is losing another pawn, of course, unless white would capture the rook right now. So let's see what's going on if white does just that. Well, queen would be capturing back with various checkmate threats. The king has to try to run, and now the chase begins. Check on a3. The king now cannot go to b1 because of the immediate checkmate, so it has to continue running, and the chase continues. Bishop h6, king e2, check, king f1, check again, which attacks the rook in the corner as well. Now if king g1, checkmate arrives with bishop e3, king h2 and queen f2. That was quick and easy. Or if the king goes the other way to e1, then of course the rook simply gets taken and black is up 3 pawns while the attack is still continuing. So let's go back to our position after the sacrifice with rook c3 and see what could happen if white plays differently, namely tries to attack the queen. That's exactly what happened in the game. And now comes the quite amazing part, that actually black can do even better than just moving the queen away by immediately creating another sacrifice, which doesn't just offer the rook to be taken but leaves the queen also on pre. So first of all, what happens if rook takes? Well, then rook takes b2. If king a1, then discovery with rook b4, and rook d4, then bishop takes will lead to black's winning position. Or if the king goes to c1 right now, then the second rook comes into the game. White has no choice but block it, and now black would capture with the bishop, with some deadly discover checks coming up. So let's go back one more time and see what happens if white captures the rook instead of the queen. After king c2, now white is up an exchange, but black also has 2 extra pawns. So in reality there is a material equality, but the key is the continuation of the attack. Now queen g2 is quite a good idea also, because the rook cannot block, needing to protect the other rook on f1, or if the queen blocks, then queen e4. Black chose a different route, equally good, by playing queen e2. Exactly same ideas. If rook blocks, the f1 rook is unprotected. If the king moves, then queen b2. So white's best choice is to block with the queen, and now black gets a third pawn with queen e4. And here, relatively the best choice white had was to block the check again, even though black's advantage is quite overwhelming anyway. Black would be continuing with queen b4, queen b3, and now black could choose even to trade queens. And then play bishop e5, and then start running with the pawns. For example, rook c1, f5, rook c7, rook f7, and then bring the king up, of course. In an endgame like this, when you have pawns running, you typically want your king also participating and supporting those pawns, and black has excellent winning chances. Of course, it wasn't quite necessary to trade the queens immediately either. In this position, black could, for example, give a check first with rook c8 and trade queens afterwards, and then play similar plans with bishop e5. So let's go back and see what happened in the game. White played worse than this. After the queen e4 check, right here, white played in the game king b3. Now after king b3, the king is out all in the wild. It's not a good thing. Black could certainly play just calmly with bishop e5 protecting the pawn, but when you see a king kind of out in the open without the safety or the protection of the pawns, you generally want to go for more than just slowly but surely. You can go for the kill, and exactly that's what black did right now. Black played b5, which is certainly going for the kill, threatening checkmate immediately in one move. If now white plays queen b4, trying to prevent the checkmate threat, then black would respond with queen e2, threatening checkmate from a different place on b2, and then after king a3, continue with rook e8, bringing the rook also into the attack. The game continued instead of queen b4 in this position, with white trying to prevent the checkmate with rook f4. And then black played queen e6, and white threw in the towel. For example, if the king moves to a3, in addition to making a simple pin with the bishop, black can continue the attack by playing a5, and then trying to play b4 and going after the kill after the king. going back just a little bit here, exactly. So after rook c3, if the other rook would have gone to f1, well, things wouldn't have been that terribly different. Black would still play rook c2, and after rook takes f3, rook b2 check, king c1, rook c8, and even though now the white king can run towards d1, black would still be in a winning position after rook check and the second rook check, king e3 or d3, rook c3 check, and after that capturing the rook on h1. Even here black has an excellent position, having a rook, bishop, and several pawns for the queen. Although probably this was relatively the best choice that white had after the rook c3 sacrifice. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, which was composed by Procas, the task is, how can white win? I suggest you take a little bit of time and try to figure out the correct solution. Well, what may be the task, the solution, how to win? Well, white has a pass pawn on the g file, but it seems to be rather far away from promotion. The good news is the black knight is in the corner, and it may get stuck there. So let's combine those ideas in trying to promote the g-pawn and trying to keep the black knight in the corner. So the correct answer is white immediately running with the pawn. Now black has two options, either to try to run with the king to hold off the pawn or running with the knight. Let's first see what happens if black runs with the knight. Pawn advances, knight captures pawn, and now comes the key move. Not immediately g6, when indeed the black knight would arrive on time, but instead of pushing the pawn in this position, white plays a preventive move, bishop d7, a beautiful move, cutting the knight out from all these squares. And if the knight tries to catch the pawn now, it will arrive just a move too late. A beautiful, beautiful move. So, now let's see what happens if after g4 the king is the one trying to run. g5, king e5, g6, king f6. And it seems that all is under control. The king held off the white pawn, and worst comes to worst, even if black loses the knight and the last two pawns, and all he gets is the little white pawn on g6, it's still a draw. However, it's not the case. Black doesn't get there. White has a brilliant way of hanging on to his last pawn and at the same time making sure the black knight does not get out of the corner. And that brilliant move is bishop f5. Now, if the king takes the bishop, the g-pawn runs away and won't be able to be stopped. And of course, very importantly, the bishop now controls the c2 square also, so the knight has no way out. And if black plays d4, then the king simply runs to the corner and traps the knight. After a4, white would have the time to just capture the pawn first, and then go back and trap the knight, capture it, and then go to the other side of the board to help the pawn promote. A beautiful composition. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, got some ideas on how to attack and what's important in what are priorities in the position with opposite side castles. Oftentimes a pawn is not that important if you can gain the time to get your pieces to the attack. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye until next time.